Welcome back to Conflict of Interest, and we're with Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs, and we're talking about Kevin Rudd's audacious broadband plan. What do you think, Chris?
I think there are a lot of questions about the broadband plan. I think there are a lot of myths about it as well at the same time out there in the policy community and in the public debate. The first one is how much is it actually going to cost? Because we keep hearing about $43 billion.
Well, that's what I raised earlier. Yeah, where does this number come from?
Well, as far as we can tell, and it's indicative of the lack of information in the debate at the moment that we have to try to figure out where it comes from. As far as we can tell, it's a high estimate given by a couple of the telcos about how much it might cost to build a broadband network. Just off the top of the head, back of the envelope.
Back of the envelope numbers.
I reckon $43 billion.
That's the way you do. That's the way you spend taxpayers' money. Yeah. Back of the envelope.
Yeah. Well, we've got a lot of envelopes. So they've said $43 billion. At the moment, all we really know is that it's going to be $4.7 billion from the federal government. The rest is just going to be raised. They're just going to raise it.
They're going to raise it through bonds, right?
Yeah, yes. through an elaborate bond system, or at least this is what they're saying. It might change. We have to wait a number of months, I think it's something like 8 months, to find out what the process and what the program is actually going to be. You've mentioned that Tasmania is going to have it very soon. That's true, but that's actually a different network. That's a different proposal that's been accepted by the government.
Well, that's been around for a while. There's been a proposal in Tasmania for our viewers to fill them in what's been happening in the Great Southland. There's been a long-running trial in Tasmania of the existing electricity network, basically using the existing wires and the existing electricity network to run broadband. Which they say has been very successful, although when I talk to people in Hobart, I can't find one who's used it.
Who actually has it, yes.
Yeah, or two. Actually, I did find one person and they said it was terrible. But anyway, that's up and running. But, I mean, Tasmania is easy.
Tasmania is an experiment for the rest of the country.
Yeah, as usual.
You're the guinea pigs.
Yeah,
as
you're
usual.
the guinea pigs. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter if it doesn't work in Tasmania.
That's right.
So they're going to get the Tasmania network up well and running, or at least they probably will get the Tasmania network up and running. But we have to wait 8 months or so to find out what the new broadband network's going to be. And then we're going to have to wait 8 years, as you've mentioned, for it to be rolled out over the country. There are just so many questions about this. We don't really know much more than, a press release worth of information.
But Chris, are you opposed to it per se, or are you saying you need more detail to work out whether this is a good idea or not, and it's just far too early to say?
I don't think the answer is yes. I'm opposed to it as it stands. In general.
And why? And why?
Why is that?
Because it doesn't actually resolve any of the complicated problems that are in the Australian telecommunications industry and have been for the last decade.
Such as?
At the moment, we have a big, major regulatory failure. Ever since privatisation, the idea was that a lot of companies would be able to buy access on Telstra's network, as you understand, but then they would start investing more into the network of their own stuff. And then eventually, they'd be building their own networks, and we'd have lots of different networks. We'd have Optus networks and Vodafone broadband networks, and all those sorts of other companies would be competing directly with Telstra on an infrastructure basis. That has not happened.
Partly that's because of Telstra, though, isn't it?
No, I don't think it is. I think partly it's because of the price that the government says Telstra has to sell its network. Why, if you're a small internet service provider, would you build your own network when it's much cheaper just to buy access from Telstra? Why would you bother? It doesn't make any financial or business sense for you to do so.
So you think, I mean, because it's interesting, Sophie was saying earlier that Rudd has managed to screw Telstra royally here. I'd prefer to say presidentially, but we'll live with royally. But so that's the politics of it, and that looks good. And a lot of the media commentary has been saying, it's Telstra's, Telstra's to blame here. But you're saying, well, hang on, it's not that simple. That Telstra's actually been, in other words, sort of forced by the government over the years to effectively sell a product, access, at a very low price.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Now, this is not to say that Telstra is a great company or a bad company or anything like that. But the discussion about Telstra in this debate has been very much Telstra are the bad guys refusing to give us broadband and that sort of thing. it's actually a far more complicated problem. And the problem I have with the broadband network is that it continues that fiction that it's just something that if we pay for it, it'll fix itself.
Yeah.
And Telstra won't be involved and everything will be fine. Telstra will be involved. Telstra has to be involved. They own too much of the base network. Between cities and to the countries and the big infrastructure that nobody sees.
But even if it was opened up to service providers, surely it's just too expensive to roll out their own network. The logistics of doing that, isn't it? That just
no. Telstra,
impossible?
for instance, really want to roll out a broadband network, and they have for many, many years. If you think back to the broadband debate 2 years ago or 3 years ago, it was all about Telstra wants to roll out this network, but the government insisted on keeping a regulatory framework that Telstra didn't like or Telstra thought would make it unprofitable. So Telstra wants to do it. There's also a lot of examples of other broadband networks in Australia that get rolled out by the private sector. The Optus rolled out a cable network to vast swathes of the Australian population. Foxtel is on a cable, and that goes to vast swathes of the population. There are companies wanting to roll out these broadband networks. The problem is that they can't, or they don't think it'll be profitable to do so while this regulatory framework is operating.
What about rolling out fibre to the home, though, which is what the government is
That's
saying
where the
that they
government's
will
got a lot
do?
of praise. A lot of people have said
Can
that's really cool.
Yes,
Of
yeah.
course, not
And
just the end of the street.
And
it
so
goes into
can
the
these
home.
companies afford to deliver that?
Yeah, this is basically a double or nothing strategy by the government.
Yes.
They figured that they couldn't get to fibre to the node. Nobody really wanted to build a fibre to the node network under their terms, so they thought, well, screw it, we'll just build a fibre to the home and see what happens. Now, companies will want to do that when they find it to be a profitable endeavour.
Yes.
If there's enough demand for a fibre to the home network, in all other things considered, in a free market, they will build a network that goes fibre to the home. If there's enough demand for it, and I think there will be enough demand for it, if not now, then into the future. The problem is that the government just wants to give everybody the gift of broadband, like a present that Kevin Rudd just slips under your door. All of a sudden you've got the fastest broadband in the world. Now, I think that's highly unrealistic, and I don't think it recognises really key truths about the network.
So, Sophie raised before the break, and we almost had a conflict. I know. Well, the show is called Conflict of Interest, but, Sophie and I, we're not the conflicting types.
We need to learn
It's
how
only
to fight,
it's only
Greg.
that other person who sits here who likes the conflict. But she did raise the issue earlier of, whether or not the government, in 4 or 5 years' time, if it wants to sell down some of its 51%, whether or not it's going to find any buyer.
Well, it depends on what terms.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's cheap, I'll buy it.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll buy
But
it.
it won't be cheap,
No, it probably won't be cheap. But if the government decides to sell it on whatever terms, and if we know anything about the way governments sell government property, they tend to sell it on very good terms for private companies, and they tend to build in all these guarantees of necessary service regulations and that sort of thing. So most likely they'll be able to sell it. Whether they'll be able to sell it in a beneficial way, in a way that doesn't take away a lot of the gains that we may or may not have made, is a totally separate question.
We're going to go to a break in a minute, but just one last question before we go to the break. One of the things that you've written in the past, in fact recently in The Age, was that in terms of jobs, I think, and here's what you've said. You've said that there are 37,000 direct jobs. That's what the government says.
Yeah.
At the peak of the project.
At the peak of the project. That's $1 million a job.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not very many jobs being created. So in terms of being the recession buster,
Yeah,
and the unemployment, soaker-upper.
I don't think a broadband network 8 years from now is going to solve the global financial crisis.
Yeah.
But I
Kevin
think
thinks
Kevin thinks a lot of things.
things will.
Kevin thinks a lot of things will solve the financial crisis.
Yeah. Most of him ideas, always ideas that come from Kevin.
Yes.
Because they're really good. We're going to go to a break, but we're going to keep Chris here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about rural and regional Australia and how this new network will affect or not affect it.